Welcome back, fellow shop rats. One of the most controversial videos on the channel happens to also be the #1 video on my channel about carburetor sizing. The funny part of that wasn't exactly my intent for what that video was about. It was more about CFM flow of an engine, not carburetor sizing. That was kind of a secondary thing. But it's definitely been interesting. That video's been out for a couple of years, and I've had some great engineering discussions, and I've gotten flamed a lot. And I don't care. It's YouTube. The video was put out in direct response to some questions that I had. That was maybe 2 years ago now. I'm not sure. But I had some people asking me about how they could know what size carburetor they should use on their street car. And that was what the video was tailored to. Now it's grown into something else completely. So I thought it was a good opportunity to just circle back around and talk more about it. After all, it is a Talk About It Tuesday. So let's talk about it. I'm Mike.
This is My Cars Shop.
At the time, as I said, I was specifically answering questions from some people who would ask me about carburetor sizing and so forth. That's what the video was addressed to. It was definitely addressed directly to street applications. And I didn't make that clear in the video because it never occurred to me that people would take it as anything else. It was just simply talking about volumetric efficiency and how many CFM an engine will flow. And it was just a 19-minute video intended to just give some people some quick stuff. Now, let me say this. The formula that I use shows you that you will end up with a smaller carburetor than you would think you would need. That's not for maximum performance necessarily. That's for drivability and for a street car. Okay, so yes, I know you could put a 650 CFM carburetor on a 350 engine and put it on a dyno and it makes so much power, and maybe you can put a 750 on it and it makes more power at 7,000 RPM. Here's the question for you. How much time in a street car does your engine spend at 7,000 RPM? Most of us drive our cars anywhere between 1 and 3,000, 1 and 4,000, maybe, if you really got a deep gear. But the reality is very few of us spend much time above 4,000 up to 7,000 RPM in the cars that we drive on the street. And a carburetor that's tailored for making maximum horsepower at those RPM ranges can inherently have issues at the lower end. It's one of the reasons why manufacturers created spread bore carburetors, was to give you a very small venturi, very small, which gives you a lot of high venturi action for very good drivability at low RPM. And then when you kick it in the kitchen, the great big ones open up and it's just, it sucks, is what I'm trying to say, in a good way. But there's so many other factors that I didn't address in that video that play into measuring airflow, and the formula doesn't take any of that stuff into account. It's just a quick and dirty. That's all it was intended to be. I mean, some of the responses I get, you would have swore that I was the one that crucified Jesus.
Well, I guess I was, and so were you, but that's another subject. We won't get into that now.
If you really want to go down the rabbit hole of understanding all of the science of this, there are plethoras of YouTube videos and articles and all kind of stuff all over the World Wide Web that can help you do that. My video was a cheap and dirty, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm just explaining what it was. But I do want to dive into it a little bit more. First of all, I will say that Motor Trend has done some articles that I found cohesive in explaining a lot of this stuff, and I would highly encourage you to go look for those. Just search Motor Trend magazine and CFM and things like that, carburetor sizing. They've got some really cool stuff. One of the things that they pointed out is something that can work really good on the dyno isn't going to work really well on the street. Now, I already said that myself by experience, but they put that right in writing there in that article and go into all the explanations of why that is, especially if it's a very heavy vehicle. You can really compromise that low end throttle response because your airflow isn't what it should be if your carburetor's too big. If it's a really light car with a really high stall converter, you're probably not going to notice that as much. So again, the application does make the difference. There are a lot of factors that affect how air flows. I mean, we have temperature, we have air density, we have humidity, which is part of air density. We have all kind of things that can make the difference. in how that's measured. Now, when they are measuring stuff,
And stuff.
they're measuring stuff in a lab. It's hopefully under controlled environments. But you go to various different engine dynos across the country, and those numbers could be a little bit different because of the atmospheric pressure and all those things that come into play. So it's not just a whoosh, it's not just a boom, boom, boom. The other thing is a lot of these carburetors, their advertised flow is not what they actually flow, is what I'm trying to say. So the only way you're going to necessarily know that is to put it on a dyno and put an airflow meter on it and see how many cubic feet per minute it's flowing. But let's talk about cubic feet per minute for just a second, because an engine flows the cubic feet that it flows. It's a mechanical factor because it's an air pump. And the more efficient that engine is, the higher the volumetric efficient number is. Okay, that volumetric efficiency number. To get a 100% volumetric efficiency number out of a naturally aspirated engine is pretty darn hard. It can be done. To get over that, it's not impossible. It can be done, but it's pretty darn hard. So most of our engines, especially in street cars, we're way down below that, okay? We're in the 85, 90%, 95% if we've done our work, if our heads flow good and all that stuff. There's all kinds of factors that come into that. So bear that in mind in what we're talking about. But cubic feet per minute is a measure of volume, right? And that's not the only factor in making an engine perform, because the other thing that really is important is the mass of the air. There's a lot of misunderstanding, and I'm only doing this as a primer. So if I say something that you don't quite get, go Google it, go search it. But I want to make this distinction. The mass of the airflow is probably a more important number in many ways than the actual cubic feet per minute, than the volume. Those two together really are what help your engine to turn power. So if you put a blower on an engine, for example, what you are doing is increasing the mass of that air. Okay, so the density is a lot more. There's a lot more air packed into each and every one of those strokes. So you get a lot more power out of that engine because now you're boosting your cylinder pressure up because you can pack more air into that engine. And that's a great misunderstanding. And in fact, a lot of people these days are moving away from the CFM measurement and they're going more towards measuring mass airflow because they feel like that's more important. And I do tend to agree with that to a certain point. Remember this, and it's very important. Maximum power does not equate necessarily to maximum performance. It's a multiplicative thing to look at, but I want to make that clear. Overall performance of an engine, especially in its drivability range, is much, much more important than getting the maximum power out of an engine if you're building a street car. But maybe that's even true to a point for a drag car too, because you want consistency, right? I don't know. We're not talking about that necessarily. I mean, just in this video alone, you can see the hypocrisy of some of what I'm saying, because I have a 413 that I'm punching out to a 426 over there, and there's a dual quad tunnel ram on it. That'll probably have a set of 750 carburetors on top of it. But that's more of a race application than a street application. If you look at my Pro Street Dart GTS, I have 1200 CFM a carburetor on there. And yes, it's a vacuum secondary, and I've got the secondaries tuned. They're not opening up 100%. But again, that's more of a race thing, even though that's a street car. It's a pro street car, and it's a little bit different than what I'm going to be doing on the 70 Challenger, or what we're going to be doing on the Duster, or so many of the other cars that we have around here. So I do use the formula to a point. I make judgment calls. I have a 600 CFM on my Scoops Dart. But it's not set to have the secondaries open up all the way. So it's running, I don't remember the number right now. See, we got 300 per. It's probably running about 450 wide open, which for a 318, that's a lot of carburetor, but it runs really, really good like that. And it's got tremendous low end throttle response. Let me make this clear. That car's got a 270 gear in it. So I really got to have it running good in the low RPM ranges, because that thing really lugs. And I had it overcarbed for a while, and it didn't perform well, and that's not a good thing. And it was terrible on gas. I'm getting 20 miles to the gallon with that thing. That's probably 300 horse. I am going to change it down and put a 290 gear in it at some point. But now, if it had a real high slippy converter with a 391 gear in the back, all that low end performance, you probably wouldn't even hardly notice it. But for a driver car that my wife drives and that we drive, we take out on dates, We love getting the good gas mileage. It really kicks you back in the seat if you stomp it up. It performs really well, and it's not got a huge amount of carburetor on it, even though physically it has a 600. It's not what it's using. But honestly, based on experience, I could probably throw a 450 Holly on that thing, and it probably would wake it up even more. In fact, I'm quite sure that it would, because of the smaller Venturis. You would get a higher speed delivery through that, and it would just have better fueling control, and I think overall some better power. Remember, the bigger the Venturis on the carburetor get, um, the bigger those throttle bores are, the lower the throttle response at low RPM. That's for flowing big stuff. So context is everything. You've heard me say it thousands of times here on the channel. I mean, let's face it, a lot of guys are into this stuff, and they're in it for the measuring, right? I've got the biggest one. I've got a 1050. I've got a 1500. I've got a 7000 CFM carburetor. I got two of them. Big toilet bowls on my motor. Oh, they're oh. I don't know about you, but I like functionality, reliability, and drivability on something I'm going to drive all the time. And I don't need to have the biggest toilet bowl on top of my engine. If you want to see that, go watch Red Green. He did that, put a toilet bowl on top of his motor. I don't need to have the maximum amount of horsepower out of my engine. I'm not necessarily about all of that. I love a good kick in the pants. I love to stomp a throttle down and have it throw me back in the seat. But I'm not going to compromise my drivability to get another 30 horsepower out of an engine. I want something that's going to be reliable. I want something that's going to work. I want something that's going to be fairly efficient with its fuel, especially with the prices of fuel these days, like scoops. I burn wreck fuel in that to get so there's no alcohol in that fuel, and it needs the higher compression or the higher octane fuel because of the higher compression that's in that little 318. So, I don't want to get 6 miles to the gallon with that car like I do with my Pro Street GTS. That wouldn't be good. We would never drive it. We wouldn't enjoy it. I ran DynoCell for many years, several years, did emissions calibration and testing. And one of the things I learned is just because it works in the DynoCell doesn't mean it necessarily is going to work well on the street. So we would do calibrations and we would try to simulate fuel mappings and so forth. This was fuel injection stuff that I worked on. That would be, drivability and so forth, and try to account for all that. And of course, we're measuring emissions through all of those different RPM ranges and so forth. But sometimes we would do those calibrations and then they put them in the car and we go, oh, that didn't work at all. Worked good on the dyno. The numbers looked really good, but it didn't always equate to the street. Let's face it, I didn't make up the formula. It's just a formula that's been out there forever. It's a formula I've used for a long, long time. And I know from personal experience, a little smaller carburetor for a street application is usually better overall than the maximum carburetor or over carbureting. I know a lot of guys say, well, I got an 850 on mine and it runs great. And then you find out that, after they idle it around for a while, they're following the plugs out and they got to change plugs, or they got to take it out on the back road and clean the plugs out, which I'm not against. But there's always something they're not telling you is what I'm trying to say. So I can just hear the comments now. Well, I've been running that 1050 on the street for blah, blah, blah. There's more to that story than you're telling me. I guarantee it. You probably got a high RPM converter, a low gear in the back, whatever. There's just more to it than meets the eye is what I'm trying to say. So I think that's enough. I just wanted to circle around and revisit it and kind of explain a little bit of the background behind that video. Not that most of the people that have seen it are going to see this video, but for the diehards on the channel, you can use that formula to say, if you're going to build a race car, you can use that formula to say, okay, this engine's going to flow this much, but with volumetric efficiency on blah, 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 I'm going to go with a little bigger carburetor, 750, 850, whatever. There's plenty of other people out there that focus on that. This channel is mostly about street driving cars, street driven cars. Like I said, we have some exceptions that we're building, but overall, that's what it's about, street performance. So that's where the formulas are coming from, and I find them to be very helpful. They help me make informed decisions. I may not go with the exact numbers. That's not the point. But it gives me okay, this engine's probably flowing that many CFM. And that really was the point of the video, as I said. It was about what the engine flows, not what size carburetor to put on. There's just a lot of other factors to consider. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Drop your comments down there because I know you always do. I appreciate you watching. And, this is just a spur thought. It's an introductory thing. It's not an end all. There's a whole internet full of information out there that you can drill deep down into the stuff that I'm talking about. And if I'm wrong,
Like I said, I didn't kill Jesus. It's okay.
thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Oh, and one more thing. Don't forget.
Rock!